G'day everybody, hope everyone's well. So this is going to be the first in a small series of videos I'm going to do on the 5VZ swap that I did. The reason I've done this is because my hard drive is not capable of holding all of the footage that I've filmed. This is also coupled with the fact that there is a lot of information that you probably should know if you're going to attempt this swap. The way that I'm going to organise these videos is I'm going to be fairly broad with what I show on film. I'm not going to show every single bolt that has to be undone in the engine. I would assume that anyone doing this swap will have a background of mechanics in mind or some kind of experience working on cars. And so with that experience, you'd be able to look at something, you'd be able to identify how it's been mounted, how it's been bolted, and you'd be able to undo the necessary things in order to remove it. Now, I really don't want to scare people. This job's actually fairly easy, providing that you know what you're doing. So the thing with knowing what you're doing, it's pretty much experience and just reading as much as you can online. There's a lot of help and useful information regarding this swap. Hopefully these videos are going to be a good portion of that. The main thing that you have to get over when you're launching a job like this is the fear factor. Most people, or people with not a whole lot of experience, they might see a job like this as daunting and they won't want to launch it. But the thing about these jobs is as soon as you've launched it and you've actually taken the engine out or something along those lines, you've pretty much bitten off the end of the dragon's tail and you're going to have to finish it because you need your car running. So that will give you enough enthusiasm, hopefully, to continue and finish the swap. What I'm going to encompass in this video is taking the engine out and preparing the 5VZ to go in. So it's a really good idea, even if the motor's in pieces like mine was, just to be as careful as you can when you're taking it apart and labeling everything. This is just good practice. Even if the motor's going to scrap, it's usually a good idea to just label things, just in case down the track you need a bolt. There's a lot of parts that are transferable between the 3 and 5VZs, things like bolts that mount the power steering pump or things such as that. But the first thing you got to do is prepare the engine to be removed. You got to take the rad out, you got to drain the coolant. You've got to drain the oil. You can take the engine out with the oil in it, but there's a chance that you might get into a mess. If the engine leans on an angle, the rear lip seal or the rear main seal can just bypass and leak oil straight out because there's no pressure to create a seal. So once the radiator's out, the next thing that you're going to have to get access to is the ECU. So the ECU in the 92 or 2nd gen 4runner sits in the passenger side footwell if it's in a right-hand drive Australian model. It is quite annoying to get access to it. You've got to take out the blower or the heater motor box, and this is quite difficult. There's bolts to undo, and you've also got to sort of lever it out and yank it out, and yeah, it's a bit of a pain. But once you have access to it, you can take the plugs off the back, and they can be yanked through the firewall, through the hole. The whole loom that attaches to the engine that has these annoying plastic tabs which are bolted down. These are quite a fiddle if you want to take them off. I ended up just breaking mine with a screwdriver. You can save them if you really want. Even if you were going to reuse the 3VZ, you could probably just get rid of them and then wrap up the loom with some loom tape or some electrical tape. If you watch my wiring video for the Link ECU and my Hilux, you'll see how I did mine. The loom also connects under the car. It connects to the reverse sensor, some of the 4-wheel drive switches and sensors, as well as the O2 sensor. So the nice thing about a 4-wheel drive, or one that's got a 2-inch lift in it like this one, is you can get under it without jacking it up. Again, as I stated before you take any of the sensors off, you should wrap some tape around the actual clip and write on it with a paint marker to identify what it is. This not only makes it easier to reconnect if you're reusing the loom in a 3VZ, this is also going to make it much easier when we do the wiring down the track, because there's a bunch of sensors, or there's a bunch of electrical clips such as the reverse sensor and the 4-wheel drive solenoid switches that you will have to reuse when you put the 5VZ in. And so having them labelled makes it much easier when you're chasing the wires with the multimeter. With the loom off and out of the way, I'll put it to the side in the shed. The next thing that you'll be able to take off is the power steering and the AC pumps. So I actually left my AC lines are still connected to the AC pump. I took the pump itself off. The power steering pump is easier to take off. You take off both the lines going to it. There may be residual oil in the lines. You should drain it first. Use a big syringe or something. But you see here, if you put the outlet on a cup and then spin the wheel around the right direction, it should pump any excess oil inside it into the cup. And that way when you go put it down on the floor of your shed, you don't get a massive mess everywhere. Also something to note, whenever you're working with items that work under pressure in operation, there's always the chance for trapped pressure to be caught somewhere. So always be mindful, make sure you're wearing safety glasses, and there's tricks you can use to try and not hurt yourself should there be trap pressure in there, which I'll explain later on. Because the motor in the car was in disrepair, I ended up just taking the other head off just so the geometry was easier to negotiate when I pulled the engine out. You can easily pull the engine out fully assembled, but again, it's all about how much of an effort you want to put in. It may be easier, for instance, to take off the intake manifold or other things just because it eases access to things like all of the injectors and the loom when you need to take it out. So think about that. 10 minutes to take something off might save you massive headaches down the track. Once everything's been taken off and you're happy with the engine, you can go ahead and take the bonnet off so that you can hook up the engine crane. You can use sort of whatever you want to lift the engine out. If you're brave enough, you can use a seat belt, but geez, man, I suggest not. I used a 1-ton sling. You can use chains. It all depends on what you got at hand. But yeah, just be mindful. Don't use ratchet straps. Make sure you leave the engine bolted up to everything until the last minute when the crane's hooked up to it. And take some slack on the crane until there's a little bit of tension in the line, and then get ready to undo the bolts. Again, make sure there's not too much tension, otherwise the second you undo the whole thing, it's going to jump up and it might crush your hand. There's always a bit of a fiddle to try and get the engine to break loose from the bell housing and the input shaft. Usually just a jiggle is fine. Try not to put too much tension on it. You may need to use a pry bar, but usually just take a bit of tension until you see the engine lift up off the mounts and you see it pivot on the gearbox mounts. Then just put your hands on it, give it a bit of a yank back and forward, and it should come off relatively easily. Thankfully, the 4runner, even when it's got a 2-inch lift, the engine's easy to get out. If you've watched my video where I took the engine out of my Nissan Patrol, that thing's sitting on 35-inch tyres with a 3-inch lift, and you've actually got to drop the car down. You've got to take the wheels off and sit the car on bricks on the axle so that the car is low enough to get the oil pan to clear the radiator support. But thankfully the 4runner was much easier to negotiate getting the engine out. Once the engine's out, you can go ahead and take the clutch and the flywheel off. So I reused the 3VZ flywheel in the 5VZ engine. I spoke about it in the previous video I made. It may necessarily be better, but only in a few very specific circumstances. The 3VZ flywheel is plenty heavy enough. You'll have plenty of inertia to get the drivetrain moving without stalling it. And yeah, the 3VZ flywheel is just easy to use. You'll have to use the 3VZ flywheel if you have a automatic 5VZ because they don't have a flywheel. They've got the torque converter bolted to the flexi plate. You can, if you're brave enough, reuse the 3VZ clutch. I've reused the clutch in my Patrol 3 times now because it still looks good. It is an XZD tough clutch though, but in this circumstance the 3VZ flywheel and clutch were pretty toasted. So yeah, I replaced the clutch and I ended up machining the flywheel just to get the surface back. Once you've got your flywheel off, you can remove all of the other assemblies, such as the bracket that holds the power steering and the aircon compressor, and anything else you want to take off. Take off the oil pressure sensor because you're going to reuse that in the 5VZ. And once everything's off and you're happy with it, you can get ready to drain the chocolate sauce from the engine if you haven't drained the oil already. So you'll see that when I drain the oil out, yeah, it's absolutely fucking revolting, if you know what I mean, in it. Reason for this is because the car overheated, the heads warped, and there was a passage between the coolant and the oil ports, and this in turn milkshaked the entire oil pan. And yeah, even if we fix this motor up, you'd have to pedantically take everything apart, blow out all the oil passages, and yeah, it would just be a massive headache. So yeah, if anything like this happens to you, be prepared to put months of effort into getting it fixed. Okay, so today I had somebody, a professional, come by and degas my AC system, because as you can see, I pulled the engine out, I kept the air compressor, or the AC compressor, just to the side, and I left all of the pipework still together, just because you don't want to vent the gas to atmosphere, because it's pretty damaging to the planet. It's a extreme greenhouse gas component for the planet, and yeah, it's not good, and it just doesn't feel right doing that to the planet deliberately. So had it properly dispersed and properly disposed of by the company. You can see here they've left the cap off that one. So I'm going to just verify one more time by pressing the valve down on the inside. No gas left in there, even though there was a tiny bit. And I'm going to break all the connections and take the AC pump off and leave the lines in, because I'm not sure if I'm able to use those lines on the AC compressor on the 5VZ. I don't know, we'll see. I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, but yeah, for now I'm just going to remove the AC pump here. Just crack the bolts loose, so you can see that one down there I've just wound out by a little bit. Leave it together and just get a hammer of some sort and just thump open the connection like that, just in case there's still any trapped pressure or there's pressure still in the line. You won't just take it off and have it go and burn yourself. You'll be ready for it. We've got a bit of rain going on at the moment, but I'm going to be starting on doing the refurb work on the 5VZ. So I've got a timing belt, I've got the seals for both the cams, the front main, and I've got the rear main as well. And then we've got some new bearings, so new tensioner bearings, and then as well as that I've got new water pump to put on it. So we've got the engine bay all ready to put the new engine in. So now we're going to get to work on the 5VZ and start doing what we need to before we put it back in. So I actually really lucked out with this 5VZ. It was in amazing condition. You'll see when I take the water pump off and I drain the oil, it was literally, it looked like it had been serviced its whole life. That also raises questions though, because the actual car that I got it off, the wrecked car, it didn't have any crash damage on it. So again, that's a interesting question as to why the car was even scrapped in the first place, because the engine was in good condition. But to do the timing belt, you've got to take all of this front stuff off the engine. So take off all of the belts this time, because you're going to be reusing them. Label them, tie a tag to them, and identify what they are. You can inspect belts by grabbing them, sort of bending them around and looking if there's cracks in them. If there's no cracks, you're sweet to reuse them. If there's cracks, then yeah, maybe you should. They're relatively easy to replace anyway, so you can just throw them on and send it if you're brave enough. So the front parts come off the engine pretty easily. With this, you can just follow what the factory service manual tells you. It's a good idea to get the 4runner and the Prado service manual, just because it encompasses all of the wiring as well as all of the service requirements for the engines. So the only hurdle I had here was the harmonic balancer bolt. So the harmonic balancer bolts on Toyotas are just known in general to be bum-clenchingly tight. A trick you can use if your engine's in the car, which people do use, is you put a breaker bar with a socket on the actual bolt. You rest the breaker bar against the chassis rail, and then you use the starter motor to crank the engine. This in turn spins the engine, and this will then break the harmonic balancer bolt loose because they're so tight. I physically wasn't able to break it loose with my rattle gun. I even tried with a breaker bar. I couldn't get any reaction force because the engine would either rotate or it would move on the engine stand before I got enough torque through it to get it loose. I had to use a tool from work called a chain tong. This wrapped around the harmonic balancer and gave me a reaction force to torque against, and I was able to break it loose, but this is something you have to keep in mind as, yeah, it was really tight. With the harmonic balancer off, you can then start taking off all of the timing covers and everything so you can get to the timing belt itself. The timing belt's pretty easy to relieve tension off. The only thing you do have to consider is you need a small diameter ratchet, a 3/8 one with a 3/8 swivel joint. half-inch drive bars and half-inch swivel joints aren't actually able to clear between the engine and the aircon compressor mounts. I didn't have one at this stage, so I had to take off the aircon compressor and the mount so that I could get access to the bolts that held the timing tensioner in. All you got to do to take off the timing belts is just take the tensioner off, and this will give enough slack in the belt so you can pull it around and take it off the cams and the crank. If you're not too sure what you're doing, it's a good idea to get tons of photos while you're going along. I film all my stuff, so if there is the chance I don't know what's going on, I can just look back, but it's always good to capture what you're doing before you start work, just so you know how it goes before and after. So once the timing belt's off, you've got access to everything, so you can then do the water pump. The water pump on this engine is really easy, it's just a couple of bolts to take off. So once I get it off, you'll see how good a condition the water pump's actually in. Whew. Water pump's almost brand new. The thermostat's definitely brand new. Oh yeah, I think we scored a doozy here. So this again was a surprise to me. This motor had 300 and something thousand Ks on it, so I was expecting utter garbage, but it literally looked like it was brand new, the water pump. Which was an absolute score. So I chucked the new water pump on with a new gasket. Okay, I'm getting ready to put the timing belt back on now. So the water pump's on, it's all torqued up. I believe it gets 20 Newton meters. And so give everything a nice clean. What I did was I unbolted my crank sensor down here and I just cleaned it up, sprayed a bunch of cleaning product around it because it has an actual magnet in the front. And if any sort of debris, magnetic debris, ferrous metals stick themselves onto there, it might give a false reading to the ECU and your engine will throw a code, or worst case your engine won't start, which no one wants. Same story with the cam sensor, just give it a clean and make sure it's bolted in there nice and tight. And so now we're going to put the timing belt on, the new one. Again, another thing to be careful of, make sure there's no things in the valleys of the teeth on the gear, on the crank and on the cams, because any sort of debris is going to sit in there, wear the belt down faster than if it wasn't there. So with this done, you can now go ahead and install the new idler and tensioner bearings. When you're putting the bolts in, you got to be very careful with this because the threads are tapped into aluminium, and aluminium is really easy to strip the threads out of and just ruin your day. I actually stripped the threads out of the idler bearing housing, which is the oil pump, and so I had to drill it out and helicoil it to put it in, which was a massive effort. I didn't actually film it because I was that angry. But yeah, just be mindful, follow the torque procedure as per the service manual. These are two components that you could potentially reuse depending on the condition. If you see the condition of mine, again, this was another reason that I believe the engine was serviced very recently. You can visually inspect them, maybe hold the center and spin them in your fingers and put your ear up to them. If you can hear any kind of grittiness, then they're probably done for. But the bearings that these utilize, they have the plastic covers put on them to stop any obstructions or any dirt and debris getting inside. So it's all up to you. I reused the bearings on my Patrol last time because they looked in good condition. It's down to your call. This is a situation where it's good to do the preventative maintenance, but the standard sort of procedure that I follow is always ordering all of the parts that I think I'll need, just because it's better to have too many parts than have not enough parts and have your car down for longer than it needs to be. So before you replace a timing belt, or even any part you're replacing for that matter, you've got to thoroughly inspect the new part and compare it to the old one to ensure that you do have the right part. In this case, for the 5EZ timing belt, I believe they were the same brand, a Gates brand, and they do have the engine printed on them. As well as this, they have marks for the left, the right cam sprockets and the crank. You'll note earlier in the video that I did mark on the timing belt with a yellow pen some of the teeth and how they lined up on the sprockets. And what I also did was hold the belts in the exact same position and identify that they were the same length with the same number of teeth, and that the marks were lining up on the same way. So once you're happy with the belt and you're happy with how it looks, that it's the right one, you can go ahead and throw it on the engine. Something you have to note though, the marks on the belt say left and right. However, if you look at the front of the motor, the cam sprockets are right and left. You visualize this as though you're looking at the engine from the flywheel, you're looking at it from behind. So make sure you don't put it on the wrong way around. I actually did, and I had to change this. But all you've got to do is put the marks on the belt. There's arrows that should point to the front of the motor. And you put the belt on and line everything up. And once you're happy with it, you can get ready to put the timing belt tensioner in. So the timing belt tensioner is a little hydraulic piston. You have to compress it so that you can lock it in its fully down position. The way I compressed mine was I put it in a machine vise that I made, and you just wind it in slowly. You'll wind it in a bit and it'll build internal oil pressure to a point where you can't wind it in anymore. There's a tiny little oil port inside it that slowly allows the pressure to decrease as the oil transfers to the other side of the piston. And you'll just leave it for about a minute or 5 minutes here and there, and just wind it in a little bit more until it fully bottoms out. And once it bottoms out, it will line up some pinholes so that you can put a little nail or a little grenade pin through it and lock it in the fully down position. This is a point where you need to be very careful. It might suddenly release tension and fling the pin out, so make sure you've got your safety glasses on. Once you've put the pin through and it's locked in its fully down position, you can take it out of the vise. Just again, do it slowly, be careful. And then you can take it over to the motor and bolt it up. Just don't forget to put on the little rubber grommet. I think this thing just stops dirt and grime getting in, which could clog it up and jam it. But once you bolt it up and give it the torque that it requires on the bolts, then you can pull out the pin, and this will then tension up the timing belt to the motor and hold it on there for however long it's going to be on. And a final check for good practice, once everything's been put on properly, what you do is you will wind the motor through a full cycle, so that's 4 strokes of rotation. So 4 strokes of rotation is 2 360s on the crank, and what you should observe once you've wound the 2 360s is that the timing marks line up perfectly. And once you've observed this and you're happy with this, then you should be good to put the timing covers on and get everything on the front of the motor back on. Once you've done all this, you can get ready to pull the oil pan off. The reason we have to pull the oil pan off is because the oil pan on the 5VZ, from the Prado at least, is a different geometry to the 3VZ oil pan in the 4runner. This means that it won't fit properly, it won't clear the suspension system in the 4runner. So what you have to do is take off the oil pan, swap the 3VZ oil pan and the oil pickup tube on. This is fairly straightforward, it's just unbolting the oil pan, unbolting the pickup tube. You do have to make up a new gasket for the pickup tube. I hadn't bought a gasket set that had the pickup tube gasket in it. I believe the OEM one is a steel gasket that crushes into place. I ended up just using some gasket paper that I bought from the auto store. I cut it to size and I used copper gasket cement, which I use on pretty much every gasket I use. It's really good stuff. I highly recommend using it. It's always a fiddle to cut gasket paper. It's pretty much something that comes with experience and just trial and error. The trick that I used was I put engineer's blue or bearing blue onto the surface of the pickup tube. I then put a print of it onto the gasket paper, and this gave me a template to cut out, including the bolt holes and the oil port hole. Once you're happy with your gasket and you've cemented it, make sure you clean every gasket mating surface with brake cleaner or some kind of cleaner to remove oil. This is because oil could impact how the gasket maker adheres to the surfaces and might allow a passage for oil to bypass. Even though the pickup tube is the low pressure side of the pump, there'll still be flow going through it, and any holes in the system could lower your overall oil pressure, which isn't good. So that's going to wrap up this video. Again, I would have put more into this video, but I feel that if videos extends for about the 40-minute mark, people are going to sort of skip through them and miss potential important information. This is coupled with the fact that, again, my hard drive is too small to fit all of the footage I've filmed. So we're going to leave this video here. There's still a bit more work we have to do on the 5EZ before it goes in the car. So anyway, I hope everyone's enjoyed this video. I'm going to continue to put these out. I'm going to try and be a bit more timely with the next few videos because I've just been a bit lazy recently. But apart from that, make sure you like and subscribe, share this video around, and feel free to look at the videos on my channel as well. There's a lot of information I've encompassed recently. Rear main seals, engine overhauls, all of the important things if you're going to do any kind of build. As well as that, feel free to leave a comment. I'm more than happy to answer any questions or give a hand with anyone that needs some information. And that pretty much wraps things up for this video. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Stay safe, and I'll see you all in the next one.